Critical thinking for overthinkers. Transform your mind from anxiety to clarity. A journey of self-discovery through integrated thinking. Chapter 1. Redefining thoughts. The workshop venue was nothing like Olivia had imagined. Instead of the sterile conference room she'd expected, she found herself in a converted industrial loft. Warm morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating worn wooden floors and exposed brick walls. Potted plants dotted the space, and comfortable chairs were arranged in a loose circle. It felt more like a friend's living room than a place for serious study. Sarah, ever punctual, was already there, waving from a corner where she'd saved 2 seats. As Olivia made her way over, she noticed the diversity of the group gathering. Young professionals like herself, older adults with graying hair, even a few people who looked barely out of college. All of them wore the same, slightly uncertain expression she felt on her own face. "I was starting to worry you might back out," Sarah whispered as Olivia sat down. The concern in her friend's voice made Olivia wince internally. Had she become that predictable in her avoidance? Before she could respond, a woman in her 50s stepped into the center of the circle. She had silver-streaked dark hair and wore a simple black turtleneck that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. Her presence immediately commanded attention without demanding it. "Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Elena Chun, but please call me Elena. This workshop isn't about hierarchy. It's about learning together." Her voice carried a warmth that seemed to relax the tension in the room. "We're here to explore critical thinking, but perhaps not in the way you're expecting." Elena paused, looking around the circle with a gentle smile. "Before we begin, I'd like you to take out your phones." A rustle of movement filled the room as people reached for their devices. "Now, please turn them off completely. Not silent, not vibrate, but off." Olivia felt a flutter of anxiety as she powered down her phone. What if work needed her? What if there was an emergency? The familiar spiral of what-ifs began to spin in her mind. "I can see some of you are already uncomfortable," Elena noted. "That's perfect. Let's start there. Who would like to share what they're feeling right now?" The room remained silent for a long moment. Olivia's heart pounded as she debated whether to speak. Finally, a young man across the circle raised his hand. "I feel exposed," he said. "Like I've lost my safety net." Elena nodded encouragingly. "Thank you, Marcus. Anyone else?" Before she could stop herself, Olivia found her hand rising. "I'm worried about missing something important," she admitted, her voice shakier than she'd like. "And now I'm analyzing whether I should be worried about being worried." A few chuckles of recognition rippled through the group. "Excellent observation, Olivia," Elena said. "You've just demonstrated one of the key challenges many of us face, meta-worry, or thinking about thinking. It's particularly common among highly analytical people." Elena moved to a whiteboard and wrote, "Critical thinking is not equal to overthinking. Many of us here have been praised throughout our lives for being deep thinkers," she continued. "We've built our careers and identities around our analytical abilities. But somewhere along the way, some of us have lost the distinction between critical thinking and overthinking. Today, we're going to start redrawing that line." She drew 2 columns on the board. Critical thinking, purposeful, time-bounded, solution-oriented, balanced with action. Overthinking, circular, endless, problem-focused, paralyzing. "The key difference," Elena explained, "isn't in the depth of thought, but in its nature and purpose. Critical thinking is a tool we use consciously. Overthinking is when the tool starts using us." Olivia found herself leaning forward, recognition flooding through her. How many nights had she lost to those circular thoughts, analyzing past conversations or future scenarios until they lost all meaning? "Let's try an exercise," Elena announced. "I want you to pair up with the person next to you. Person A will share a current worry or concern, but you only get 30 seconds to explain it. Person B will then ask 3 questions, not to solve the problem, but to understand it better. Then you'll switch roles." Olivia turned to Sarah, anxiety bubbling up again. "Want to be person A?" Sarah offered, knowing how Olivia struggled with going first in new situations. Olivia nodded gratefully. She listened as Sarah described her frustration with a workplace rivalry. noting how different it felt to listen with the purpose of asking questions rather than immediately trying to find solutions. When it was Olivia's turn, she found herself describing her recent presentation freeze-up at work. Sarah's questions were simple but thought-provoking. What exactly happened in that moment? How did others actually react? What would you say to a friend who had the same experience? The last question hit Olivia like a physical force. She realized she would never judge a friend as harshly as she had been judging herself. "Time's up," Elena called. "What did you notice about this exercise?" Hands shot up around the room. People spoke about how the time limit forced them to be concise, how the questions helped them see their situations from new angles, how being listened to without immediate advice felt refreshing. "What you've just experienced," Elena explained, "is the difference between rumination and reflection. Rumination is like a hamster wheel, lots of energy expended, but no forward movement. Reflection is like a spiral staircase. You might revisit the same themes, but you're moving to a different level of understanding." She drew a spiral on the board. Critical thinking isn't about eliminating uncertainty or finding perfect answers. It's about moving through uncertainty with purpose and clarity. The rest of the morning passed quickly as they explored different exercises and concepts. Elena introduced them to the pause method. P. Pause and notice your thought patterns. A. Acknowledge your emotions without judgment. U. Understand the trigger or context. S. Step back for perspective. E. Engage with purpose. As the workshop approached its lunch break, Elena gave them their first homework assignment. For the next week, I want you to practice intentional thinking periods. Set aside 15 minutes each day for focused reflection on a specific issue. Use a timer. When the time is up, write down one action step, however small, and move on. She smiled at their uncertain expressions. This might feel artificial at first, and that's okay. We're retraining mental habits that have developed over years. The structure is temporary scaffolding while we build new patterns. Olivia jotted down the instructions, already feeling her mind try to complicate the simple task. 15 minutes seemed simultaneously too long and too short. What if she couldn't think of an action step? What if she did it wrong? "I see some of you already overthinking the assignment," Elena said with gentle amusement. "Remember, perfect is the enemy of progress. The goal isn't to do this perfectly. It's to do it consistently." As they broke for lunch, Olivia felt both overwhelmed and oddly hopeful. Her mind was full of new concepts, but for once, they didn't feel like additional weights to carry. Instead, they felt like tools she might actually be able to use. "Want to grab lunch?" Sarah asked, gathering her things. Olivia started to decline automatically, her mind already racing ahead to work she could catch up on. But she caught herself. Was this another habitual avoidance? Another example of choosing rumination over connection? "Actually, yes," she said, surprising herself. "I'd like that." As they walked out into the crisp autumn air, Olivia realized something had shifted subtly within her. The constant chatter of her anxious thoughts hadn't disappeared, but it felt less overwhelming. For the first time in months, she felt like she might be able to find her way back to balance. Her phone remained off in her bag, and somehow, the world hadn't ended. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live with uncertainty without letting it consume her. As she and Sarah discussed the morning's insights over soup and sandwiches, Olivia found herself looking forward to the afternoon session, curious about what other tools she might discover for navigating the complex landscape of her mind. The journey ahead still seemed daunting, but at least now she had a map, and more importantly, a guide who seemed to understand the territory. As she pulled out her notebook to review her morning notes, she noticed Elena's words at the top of the page. Critical thinking isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions. Maybe that was the first step, learning to question her own thoughts with curiosity rather than judgment. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the way her mind worked. Chapter 2, The Practice Begins. The Monday morning after the workshop dawned gray and misty, matching Olivia's uncertainty as she sat at her kitchen counter. Timer set for 15 minutes as Elena had instructed. Her journal lay open before her, its blank pages somehow more intimidating than the complex spreadsheets waiting for her at work. Focus on one specific issue. Elena's voice echoed in her memory. Olivia took a deep breath and wrote at the top of the page, "Weekly team meetings. Why do they make me so anxious?" The timer started, and immediately her mind began its familiar dance of avoidance. She should be preparing for work instead. Was 15 minutes too long? Too short? What if someone emailed her right now? Her fingers tightened around her pen as she forced herself to stay seated. PUSE, she wrote, remembering Elena's framework. Under each letter, she began to explore. Pause and notice. Heart racing before meetings, constant fear of being called out, acknowledge emotions. Anxiety, imposter syndrome, fear of judgment, understand trigger. Started after the promotion last year, step back. Would I judge others as harshly as I judge myself? Engage with purpose. The last point remained stubbornly blank as the timer chimed. Olivia stared at her notes, frustration building. This wasn't the neat, solution-focused analysis she'd hoped for. But Elena's words came back to her. The goal isn't to solve everything in one sitting. It's to build awareness. Following the instructions, she forced herself to write one action step. Arrive 5 minutes early to meetings to settle my nerves. It felt insignificant compared to the magnitude of her anxiety, but it was something concrete she could do. Closing her journal, she gathered her things for work, trying to ignore the voice in her head that whispered this was all a waste of time. The office was already humming with activity when she arrived. Her colleague Marcus, not the same Marcus from the workshop, but the coincidence made her smile, waved her over to his desk. "Hey, Olivia, could you look over these projections? Something feels off, but I can't pin it down." Usually, this kind of request would send her into a spiral of perfectionism. She'd spend hours analyzing every number, questioning her judgments, worrying about missing something crucial. Today, she decided to try something different. "Sure," she said, pulling up a chair. "Let's set a timer for 20 minutes and see what we can spot together." Marcus looked surprised but nodded. As they worked through the spreadsheet together, Olivia found herself more focused than usual. The time constraint prevented her from falling into her usual overthinking patterns, and having Marcus there made it feel more like collaboration than judgment. "There," she pointed after 15 minutes. "The seasonal adjustment formula isn't accounting for the new market variables. That's throwing everything off." "That's it." Marcus grinned. "I've been staring at this all morning. How did you spot it so quickly?" Olivia was about to deflect the compliment with her usual self-deprecation, but caught herself. "Good fresh eyes, I guess," she said instead. "Sometimes a different perspective helps." As she walked back to her desk, she realized something. She'd just applied critical thinking without falling into overthinking. The time constraint had actually helped her think more clearly, not less. Her momentary satisfaction was interrupted by an email notification. Team meeting moved to 10 a.m. Strategy review required. Immediately, her stomach clenched. The familiar parade of anxious thoughts began their march. She wasn't prepared. Everyone would see she didn't belong here. She should have spent the morning preparing instead of journaling and helping Marcus. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her journal and flipped to a new page. 5 minutes until the meeting. Instead of letting her thoughts spiral, she wrote, "Facts. I know the current strategy. I've been working on these projects daily. I can ask questions if needed. One meeting doesn't define my value." It wasn't perfect, but it helped. Following her morning's resolution, she packed up her materials and headed to the conference room 5 minutes early. To her surprise, she wasn't alone. Her manager, Rachel, was already there, reviewing notes. "Olivia, perfect timing. I wanted to run something by you before the others arrive." As they discussed a new client proposal, Olivia felt her anxiety slowly ebbing. The extra few minutes gave her time to settle into the space, to remind herself that she belonged here. When others began filing in, she was already engaged in the discussion, no longer feeling like an outsider looking in. The meeting itself wasn't perfect. She stumbled over a few explanations, and at one point couldn't immediately answer a question about projections. But instead of spiraling into self-recrimination, she heard Elena's voice. "Perfectionism is the enemy of progress. I'll need to verify those numbers," she said calmly. "I can follow up this afternoon." No one seemed bothered by this response. The meeting continued, And the world didn't end because she didn't have every answer immediately available. During lunch, she found a quiet corner in the office kitchen and opened her journal again. Something felt different about today's experiences, and she wanted to capture it while it was fresh. As she wrote, patterns emerged. The time-bounded analysis with Marcus had been more effective than her usual endless reviewing. Arriving early to the meeting had actually reduced her anxiety rather than giving her more time to worry. Even her imperfect responses hadn't led to the catastrophic outcomes her anxiety always predicted. Maybe, she wrote, the goal isn't to eliminate uncertainty, but to learn to work with it. The afternoon brought its own challenges. A client called with an urgent request that threw her carefully planned schedule into disarray. Her initial impulse was to skip her therapy appointment to handle it, but Elena's words about balance echoed in her mind. Instead, she took a moment to apply the pause method. Notice the rushing panic, the need to prove herself, accept that she felt torn between responsibilities. Understand this was about more than just scheduling S. Step back and look at option Z. Engage with a solution. After this quick analysis, she made a decision. She delegated part of the client work to a capable junior team member, rescheduled non-urgent tasks, and kept her therapy appointment. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a balanced one. That evening, as she sat down for her daily reflection time, Olivia realized something important. Critical thinking wasn't just about analyzing external problems. It was about understanding and managing her own patterns of thought and behavior. She wrote in her journal, "Today I learned, time constraints can enhance focus rather than limit it. Preparation can be about centering yourself, not just gathering information. Imperfect action is better than perfect paralysis." The timer chimed, and she wrote her action step for tomorrow. Schedule specific times for email checking instead of constant monitoring. As she closed her journal, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How was day, one of the new mindful you?" Olivia smiled as she typed her response. Messy. Imperfect. But maybe that's exactly how it needs to be. Setting her phone aside, she noticed the tension in her shoulders had eased slightly. One day hadn't transformed her into a perfectly balanced person, but it had shown her that change was possible. Small steps, consistent practice, and most importantly, self-compassion. These were the tools she was beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, she allowed herself to acknowledge the small victories of the day. As Elena had said, critical thinking wasn't about having all the answers. It was about learning to ask better questions. Today, she had begun to ask better questions of herself, and that was progress worth celebrating. Chapter 3. When Theory Meets Reality. 2 weeks after the workshop, Olivia sat in her office, staring at an email that made her previous anxieties seem almost quaint. The message was from the CEO himself, requesting her to lead a critical review of their biggest client account, one that had been showing concerning signs of dissatisfaction. "Your analytical skills make you perfect for this," the email read. "We need someone who can think critically about where we're falling short and how to fix it. Present findings to the board next Friday." 10 days. She had 10 days to analyze a complex client relationship, identify problems, and present solutions to the most senior people in the company. The familiar tide of panic began to rise, but this time, something was different. Instead of immediately drowning in it, she reached for her journal, now a constant companion. "Pause," she wrote at the top of the page. Pause and notice. Heart racing, tight chest, urge to either overwork or avoid it. Acknowledge emotions. Fear, yes, but also excitement. Pride at being chosen. You understand context. This is a vote of confidence, not a test of worth. Step back. What would Elena advise about approaching this? Engage purposefully. Break it down into manageable steps. Taking a deep breath, she flipped to a clean page and began listing what she actually knew versus what she was assuming. It was a technique Elena had taught them in the second workshop session, the knowledge inventory. Known. Client has expressed dissatisfaction. We have data from the past year. I have access to the account team. I have relevant analytical skills. Assume. I need to find perfect solutions. The board expects a flawless presentation. I'm not qualified for this. failure would be catastrophic. Looking at these lists, she remembered Elena's words. Assumptions are thoughts wearing fact costumes. Strip away the costume, and you can examine the thought itself. She decided to approach this project differently than she would have before. Instead of diving into endless analysis alone, she would use critical thinking to guide her process. She set up 3 phases: gather, analyze, and synthesize, with specific time frames for each. First, she scheduled interviews with the account team, creating focused questions that would help identify patterns rather than just collecting complaints. She was surprised to find that team members were eager to talk, especially when she explained her approach. It's refreshing, her colleague James commented after their discussion. Usually these reviews feel like witch hunts. You're actually trying to understand the system, not just find someone to blame. By day 4, patterns began emerging from her data collection. The client's dissatisfaction wasn't about any single issue, but rather a disconnection between their evolving needs and the company's traditional service model. It was a structural problem, not a performance one. This realization brought both clarity and new anxiety. Structural changes were harder to implement than personnel changes. Would the board be open to such fundamental recommendations? That evening, during her daily reflection time, she found herself struggling with doubt again. The timer ticked away as she wrote. I know what needs to be said, but I'm afraid to say it. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm right, but they don't want to hear it? Maybe I should just focus on smaller, safer recommendations. The timer chimed, interrupting her spiral. Following Elena's instructions about always ending with an action step, she wrote, schedule meeting with Rachel, manager, to test initial findings. The next day, Rachel listened intently as Olivia walked through her analysis. When she finished, Rachel was quiet for a moment. This is going to ruffle some feathers, she finally said. But I think you're right. The question is, how do we present this constructively? Together, they began mapping out a presentation strategy. Rachel suggested framing the structural changes as opportunities for innovation rather than criticisms of the current system. Critical thinking isn't just about finding problems, she pointed out. It's about seeing possibilities. This conversation marked a turning point for Olivia. She began to see how her new approach to thinking could actually make her more effective, not just less anxious. She was still nervous about the presentation, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear of before. The next few days were intense, but focused. She practiced Elena's time-boxing technique, allocating specific periods for different tasks and forcing herself to move forward rather than getting stuck in endless refinement. When anxiety struck, she would pause, acknowledge it, and return to her structured approach. The night before the presentation, she felt the familiar urge to stay up late revising everything one more time. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote, I've done the work. I've thought critically, not just anxiously. Whatever happens tomorrow, I know my analysis is sound and my recommendations are well-reasoned. That has to be enough. She set her alarm and, surprisingly, fell asleep almost immediately. The board presentation itself became a lesson in applying critical thinking under pressure. When questions came, she forced herself to pause and think rather than rushing to respond defensively. When one board member challenged her assumptions, she walked them through her analysis rather than backing down. What strikes me, the CEO said afterward, is not just the thoroughness of your analysis, but the clarity of your thinking. You've managed to take a complex problem and make it understandable without oversimplifying it. Later, alone in her office, Olivia reflected on how differently this project had felt from previous ones. The anxiety hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. By applying critical thinking to both the task and her own thought processes, she had found a balance she didn't know was possible. Opening her journal one last time, she wrote, critical thinking isn't about eliminating uncertainty or fear. It's about creating a structured way to move through them. It's about finding clarity in complexity, not waiting for complexity to disappear. The timer chimed, and she wrote her action step. Schedule lunch with Sarah to share what I've learned. As she packed up to leave, Olivia realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she viewed herself and her capabilities. The voice of self-doubt was still there, but it had become just one of many data points to consider, not the overwhelming force it once was. Walking home in the early evening light, she felt a new sense of confidence, not the brittle kind that comes from pretending to be perfect, but the genuine kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes next. She had faced a significant challenge and met it not by becoming someone else, but by learning to use her analytical nature more effectively. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Are you applying what we discussed?" For once, Olivia didn't agonize over her response. She simply wrote, "I'm learning that critical thinking isn't just a skill, it's a way of being. Thank you for helping me see that." As she clicked send, she smiled, knowing that while challenges would always come, she now had tools to face them. Not perfectly, but purposefully. And sometimes that made all the difference. Chapter 4, Beyond the Workplace. It was Saturday morning, and Olivia sat in her favorite cafe, absently stirring her now-cold coffee. Across from her, her younger sister Emma was in the middle of describing her latest relationship crisis, tears threatening to spill over. "And now I don't know if I should give him another chance," Emma concluded, looking at Olivia expectantly. "What do you think?" In the past, Olivia would have immediately launched into problem-solving mode, offering detailed analysis and concrete solutions. It was her default response to any emotional situation. Treat it like a business case, find a logical answer. But Elena's words from their last workshop session echoed in her mind. Critical thinking in personal relationships isn't about finding the right answer. It's about asking the right questions and holding space for complexity. Taking a deep breath, Olivia tried a different approach. "Before I share my thoughts, can you tell me what you want most right now? Understanding? Solutions? Or just someone to listen?" Emma looked surprised by the question. After a moment, she said quietly, "I just need someone to help me make sense of all this. My thoughts are so jumbled." Olivia nodded, pulling out her journal, an action that had become almost reflexive. "Let's try something," she suggested. "Instead of jumping to conclusions, why don't we explore this together?" She drew a line down the middle of a blank page. "Let's look at this situation from different angles. Not just pros and cons, but the deeper patterns and feelings involved." As they talked, Olivia found herself applying Elena's structured thinking techniques in a new way. Instead of trying to solve Emma's problem, she focused on helping her sister see it more clearly. They explored the relationship's patterns, Emma's values and needs, and the difference between fear of being alone and genuine desire for reconciliation. "You know," Emma said after a while, wiping her eyes, "no one's ever helped me think about it this way before. Usually people just tell me what to do." The conversation with Emma sparked something in Olivia. She began to realize that critical thinking could be a tool for deepening relationships, not just managing them. Over the next few weeks, she started noticing how often she had used analysis as a way to avoid emotional connection rather than enhance it. This awareness was put to the test when her mother called with news that sent Olivia's carefully constructed balance sideways. "Your father's had some concerning test results," her mother said, voice carefully controlled. "The doctors want to run more tests next week." Immediately, Olivia felt her old patterns kick in. She wanted to research every possible diagnosis, create contingency plans, anything to avoid feeling the fear that was rising in her chest. But instead of diving into medical websites, she paused. Opening her journal, she wrote, "Pause P. Notice the urge to control through information A. Accept that I'm scared and that's normal you. Understand that research won't change the reality S. Step back and consider what's truly needed now E. Engage with the situation as it is, not as I wish it to be." This led her to call her mother back, not to ask for medical details, but to simply say, "This must be really scary. How are you holding up?" The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had before. Her mother opened up about her fears, and for once, Olivia didn't try to fix anything. She just listened, asked thoughtful questions, and allowed the uncertainty to exist without trying to analyze it away. Later that week, during the workshop, Olivia shared this experience with the group. "I'm learning that critical thinking doesn't mean emotional detachment," she said. "Sometimes it means being critically aware of when not to analyze." Elena smiled. "Exactly. The goal isn't to think our way out of feeling, but to think clearly about what we're feeling and why." This new understanding was further tested when Sarah, her closest friend, announced she was considering moving across the country for a job opportunity. Olivia's immediate instinct was to create a detailed pros and cons list for her friend. Instead, she caught herself and tried something different. Over dinner at their favorite restaurant, Olivia asked Sarah, "How do you feel when you imagine yourself there?" The conversation that followed revealed layers of hopes and fears that no logical analysis could have uncovered. Sarah confessed that the job itself wasn't what excited her. It was the idea of adventure, of proving she could start fresh. This led to a deeper discussion about what they both wanted from life, dreams they'd never fully articulated before. "You've changed," Sarah observed as they walked home. "A few months ago, you would have handed me a spreadsheet comparing cost of living and career trajectories." Olivia laughed, but she knew it was true. She was learning to integrate critical thinking with emotional intelligence in a way that made both more effective. This integration was put to the ultimate test when her father's test results came back. The diagnosis wasn't the worst they had feared, but it would require significant lifestyle changes. As the family gathered to discuss next steps, Olivia found herself naturally falling into a new role. Instead of trying to control the situation through analysis, she helped facilitate a conversation that balanced practical needs with emotional support. She used her critical thinking skills to help organize information and options, but she also made space for everyone's feelings and concerns. "You're good at this," her father said afterward, squeezing her hand, finding the middle ground between thinking and feeling. That evening, during her reflection time, Olivia wrote, "Critical thinking in personal relationships means asking questions instead of offering solutions, making space for emotions without being overwhelmed by them, understanding that not every problem needs to be solved, recognizing when connection matters more than analysis." The timer chimed, and she wrote her action step. "Schedule weekly calls with Mom. No agenda, just connection." As she closed her journal, Olivia realized how much her understanding of critical thinking had evolved. It wasn't just a tool for work or problem solving. It was a way of engaging with life that could actually deepen her relationships rather than distance her from them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Thanks for today, for helping me think and feel through things." Olivia smiled as she replied, "That's what sisters are for." Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Olivia reflected on how different her relationships felt now. The anxiety about saying or doing the wrong thing had lessened. Instead, she felt more present, more capable of genuine connection. She was learning that true critical thinking wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to sit with the questions, both logical and emotional. This new understanding didn't make difficult situations easier, but it made them more manageable. She was no longer trying to think her way out of feeling or feel her way out of thinking. Instead, she was learning to do both, each informing and enriching the other. As she drifted off to sleep, Olivia realized that perhaps this was what Elena had meant about balance. Not the elimination of uncertainty or emotion, but the ability to hold both thought and feeling in a way that made life richer, deeper, and more genuinely connected. Chapter 5. Confronting Old Stories. The dream was always the same. Olivia stood at the front of her high school auditorium, frozen mid-speech, while laughter echoed around her. She woke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of that decade-old humiliation still ringing in her ears. It was 3 a.m., and despite all her progress, some ghosts still refused to be analyzed away. This particular memory, her failed valedictorian speech, had been surfacing more frequently since she'd started working with Elena. During their last workshop, Elena had talked about how critical thinking could be applied to past traumas. Our memories aren't just recordings. They're stories we tell ourselves. And like any story, they deserve careful analysis. Unable to sleep, Olivia reached for her journal, switching on her bedside lamp. Instead of trying to suppress the memory as she usually did, she decided to examine it with her new tools. Pause analysis of high school incident P. Present feelings. Shame, embarrassment, lingering sense of failure. Acknowledge. These feelings are old, but still powerful you. Understand context. I was 17, perfectionist, under immense pressure S. Step back. How would I view this if it happened to someone else? E. Engage. What can this memory teach me about my current patterns? As she wrote, something shifted. For the first time, she could see how this event had shaped her relationship with public speaking, with authority, with her own perfectionism. The memory wasn't just a source of shame. It was a key to understanding her present behaviors. The next morning, bleary-eyed but determined, Olivia brought this insight to her therapy session with Dr. Martinez. "I've been thinking about patterns," she began. "How one event can create a template for how we handle similar situations." Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. "And what patterns have you noticed?" "Well, take the speech incident. I've always seen it as proof that I can't handle pressure. But using Elena's critical thinking framework, I'm starting to see it differently. Maybe it wasn't about failure at all. Maybe it was about the impossibly high standards I set for myself." They spent the session exploring this new perspective. Dr. Martinez introduced the concept of reframing, not just analyzing past events, but actively challenging the narratives we build around them. "Think of it like being a detective," he suggested. "You're not trying to change what happened, but you're gathering new evidence about what it means." This idea resonated with Olivia. Over the next few weeks, she began applying critical thinking tools to other difficult memories. Her parents' divorce when she was 12, her first professional setback, relationships that had ended badly. Each examination revealed patterns she hadn't noticed before. During one workshop session, Elena had them partner up for an exercise in story archaeology. Olivia worked with Marcus, who had become a friend over the weeks. "Choose a memory that still has power over you," Elena instructed. "Then help each other examine it using the critical story analysis framework. What are the facts of what happened? What meaning did you assign to those facts? What alternative interpretations might be possible? How does this interpretation affect your present behavior?" Olivia shared about the speech incident, and with Marcus's thoughtful questions, she began to see new angles. Yes, she had frozen. Yes, there had been some laughter. But she had also gotten back up and finished the speech. Some students had even complimented her afterward on her recovery. "It's interesting," Marcus observed, "how we often edit out the parts of the story that don't fit our narrative." This insight led Olivia to create a new journaling exercise she called evidence collection. When negative self-talk emerged, she would deliberately look for evidence that contradicted her assumptions. It was like being her own devil's advocate, but in a constructive way. The real test came when her company announced she would be presenting at their annual client conference. Her immediate response was panic, old memories threatening to overwhelm her. But this time, she had tools to work with. Instead of avoiding the assignment or over-preparing to the point of paralysis, she approached it methodically. She analyzed her specific fears using the pause method. She collected evidence of past speaking successes. She reframed the opportunity as a chance to share knowledge, not prove worth. She set realistic preparation boundaries to avoid perfectionist spirals. The process wasn't smooth. During one practice run, she stumbled badly and felt the old shame rising. But instead of letting it derail her, she wrote in her journal, "Critical analysis of today's practice. What actually happened? I lost my place and had to start over. What meaning am I assigning? I'm going to fail again. What's the evidence for and against this interpretation? What would I tell a friend in this situation?" This structured approach helped her maintain perspective. She wasn't that 17-year-old girl anymore, and this wasn't that auditorium. The conference presentation itself became a turning point. Standing at the podium, she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, but recognized it as normal rather than catastrophic. When she briefly lost her train of thought, she paused, took a breath, and continued, just as she had practiced. Afterward, several attendees complimented her presentation, particularly noting how she had made complex information accessible. One even commented on her poise during the Q&A session. That evening, during her reflection time, Olivia wrote, "The past doesn't have to define the present. Critical thinking isn't just about analyzing current situations. It's about examining and challenging the stories that shape how we see ourselves." The timer chimed, and she wrote her action step. Schedule coffee with high school friend Lisa. Time to create new memories to balance the old ones. As she closed her journal, Olivia realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could change how she carried it. The ghosts weren't gone, but they no longer had the power to paralyze her. They had become teachers instead of tormentors. Her phone buzzed, a message from Elena. How are you applying critical thinking to your personal narrative? Olivia smiled as she typed her response, learning that every story can be re-examined, and every memory can be a source of growth rather than just pain. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, the old dream started to surface. But this time, instead of freezing in panic, she saw herself differently, not as a failure, but as a young woman learning valuable lessons about resilience and growth. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of her own strong, clear voice, telling a new story about who she was and who she was becoming. Chapter 6: When Heart Meets Mind. The email from HR arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Company-wide restructuring. All team leads required to evaluate staff for potential role changes. Recommendations due in 2 weeks. Olivia's stomach dropped as she read the message. As a recently promoted team lead, she would need to assess the performance of people who had been her peers just months ago, including her friend Jennifer, who had struggled since returning from maternity leave. This wasn't a theoretical exercise in critical thinking. These were real people's lives and livelihoods. Her decisions would affect mortgages, families, careers. The weight of it pressed against her chest as she stared at her screen. Start with what you know, Elena's voice echoed in her mind. Taking out her journal, Olivia began to map out the situation. Challenge analysis, objective factors, performance metrics, skill sets, project outcomes. Subjective factors, team dynamics, adaptation to change, potential. Personal factors, existing relationships, emotional attachments. Ethical considerations, fairness, transparency, compassion. She paused, realizing that this situation would require both the analytical skills she'd been developing and the emotional intelligence she was learning to trust. It wasn't enough to make purely logical decisions. She needed to consider the human impact while remaining fair and objective. During that week's workshop, Olivia raised the dilemma, careful to keep details confidential. How do you balance critical thinking with compassion when your decisions affect people's lives? Elena smiled, clearly expecting this type of question. This is where integration becomes crucial. Critical thinking isn't about suppressing emotions. It's about understanding how they inform our analysis and decision-making. She introduced a new framework called integrated decision-making. Acknowledge emotional responses. Identify potential biases. Gather comprehensive data. Consider multiple perspectives. Evaluate impacts at all levels. Create balanced solutions. Armed with this framework, Olivia approached her task methodically. She started by acknowledging her own emotional investments in the team. Writing them down helped her recognize where she might need to be especially careful about bias. For Jennifer's evaluation, this meant facing some uncomfortable truths. While her performance had objectively declined, was it fair to make permanent decisions based on a temporary situation? How much should adaptation potential weigh against current performance? Olivia decided to schedule individual meetings with each team member before making any recommendations. She prepared carefully, creating structured evaluation criteria while leaving room for open dialogue. Jennifer's meeting was the hardest. They sat in a small conference room, the weight of their friendship hanging between them. Before we start, Olivia said, I want you to know that this conversation is about understanding your perspective and goals, not just reviewing metrics. What followed was one of the most honest conversations they'd ever had. Jennifer spoke about her struggles balancing work and motherhood, but also about her determination to succeed. She had ideas for improving her productivity, but hadn't felt comfortable sharing them before. That evening, Olivia wrote in her journal, Integration Insights. Emotion isn't the enemy of reason. It can highlight important factors we might otherwise miss. Critical thinking can create space for difficult conversations. Sometimes the most logical solution includes emotional considerations. The next week was intense. Olivia spent hours reviewing data, conducting interviews, and wrestling with recommendations. She used Elena's time-boxing technique to prevent analysis paralysis, setting specific periods for review and decision-making. When it came time to write her recommendations, she approached each one through both analytical and emotional lenses. For Jennifer, This meant proposing a hybrid role that would allow for more flexible hours while focusing on her strongest skills. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it balanced business needs with human considerations. The final report was different from what she initially expected to write. Instead of just performance evaluations, she included analysis of team dynamics and interdependencies, impact assessments for various restructuring options, specific recommendations for role modifications, transition and support plans for affected employees. When she presented her recommendations to senior management, she was surprised by their response. "This is exactly what we needed," her director said. "You've managed to look at both the business and human aspects of restructuring. Many managers only focus on one or the other." The implementation wasn't seamless. Some difficult conversations and decisions couldn't be avoided. But by approaching each situation with integrated critical thinking, Olivia found she could be both fair and compassionate. Jennifer's situation proved to be a particular success. The hybrid role actually led to improved performance as she found a better work-life balance. Other team members saw that change wasn't necessarily threatening, and some even requested role modifications of their own. During one of their coffee breaks, Jennifer said something that stuck with Olivia. "You know what made the difference? You didn't just think about what was best for the company. You thought about what was best for everyone, including the company." This experience taught Olivia something crucial about integrated critical thinking. It wasn't about finding perfect solutions. It was about finding balanced ones that considered both facts and feelings, both systems and people. In her next workshop session, she shared this insight with the group. "I used to think critical thinking meant being purely objective, but now I see that true objectivity includes considering subjective factors." Elena nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. The goal isn't to eliminate emotion from our thinking. It's to understand how emotions and logic can work together to create better outcomes." That night, during her reflection time, Olivia wrote, "Integration lessons. Critical thinking isn't about choosing between head and heart. It's about using both effectively. Sometimes the most logical solution is the one that considers emotional impact." Balance doesn't mean compromise. It means finding solutions that work on multiple levels. Trust in the process of integrated analysis. Even when it feels messy. The timer chimed, and she wrote her action step. Schedule monthly check-ins with team members to maintain open dialogue about roles and needs. As she closed her journal, Olivia realized that this challenge had taught her something fundamental about leadership and critical thinking. It wasn't enough to analyze situations correctly. You had to understand and consider the human elements as well. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Remember, integration is a practice, not a destination." Olivia smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from the person who once thought emotions were obstacles to clear thinking. Now she understood that they were essential data points in a more complete form of analysis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she felt better equipped to face them with this integrated approach. Critical thinking, she was learning, wasn't just about finding right answers. It was about finding better ways to think about questions themselves. Chapter 7, The Ripple Effect. It started with a simple question from Marcus during their coffee break at the workshop. "How do you do it?" he asked, watching Olivia methodically work through a problem in her journal. "You seem to have this whole critical thinking thing figured out." Olivia nearly choked on her coffee. "Figured out? Hardly," she laughed. "I'm still learning every day." "But," she paused, considering, "I could show you some of what works for me." That casual offer would unknowingly set in motion a series of events that would challenge and expand her understanding of critical thinking in ways she never expected. They began meeting weekly in the cafe near their office building. Olivia shared her pause technique, her journaling methods, her way of breaking down complex problems. But as she explained these tools to Marcus, she found herself gaining new insights into them. "It's interesting," she noted in her journal that evening. "Teaching something forces you to understand it more deeply. Every question Marcus asks makes me examine my own assumptions and methods." Their informal sessions attracted attention. Soon, Sarah joined them, then Jennifer from work, then others. What started as casual coffee chats evolved into an informal study group, meeting every Wednesday morning before work. Elena, hearing about this development during their workshop, smiled knowingly. Teaching others is one of the best ways to deepen your own understanding, she said. But it also comes with its own challenges. How do you handle it when someone applies the tools differently than you would? This question proved prophetic when Sarah used the pause technique to reach a conclusion about her relationship that Olivia completely disagreed with. Olivia found herself struggling between respecting Sarah's process and wanting to point out what she saw as flaws in her analysis. During her evening reflection, she wrote, "Teaching challenge. How do I share knowledge without imposing my perspective? When is it helpful to guide versus when should I let people find their own way? What's the difference between sharing experience and giving advice?" The answer came unexpectedly during a group session when Marcus shared his struggle with a work decision. Olivia started to offer her analysis, but then remembered Elena's words about holding space for others' processes. Instead, she asked, "What does your gut tell you about this situation?" What followed was a fascinating discussion about integrating intuition with analysis. Each group member shared different approaches, and Olivia found herself learning new variations on the tools she'd been teaching. "Maybe that's the point," she wrote later. "Teaching isn't about creating copies of ourselves. It's about helping others develop their own critical thinking styles." This insight was tested when her company's HR department asked her to develop a workshop on critical thinking for junior employees. The old Olivia would have been paralyzed by imposter syndrome. The new Olivia saw it as an opportunity to learn while sharing. She approached the workshop development with the same integrated thinking she'd been practicing. Workshop planning framework. Clear objectives. What do participants need most? Practical tools. What has worked for me and others? Flexible application. How can tools be adapted? Personal connection. How to make it relevant? Growth space. Where can participants develop their own approaches? The first session was both terrifying and exhilarating. 20 young professionals looked at her expectantly as she began. Critical thinking isn't about finding perfect answers. It's about asking better questions. Throughout the day, she shared her own struggles and breakthroughs, using real examples from her journey. When participants asked questions she couldn't answer, she turned them back to the group. What do others think? How might we approach this? The response was overwhelming. Participants shared how they'd never thought about critical thinking as something that could be emotional as well as logical. One young woman stayed after to tell Olivia how relieved she was to hear that overthinking and anxiety were common challenges with real solutions. But the real breakthrough came during the second workshop session when a participant challenged her method for dealing with uncertainty. Instead of defending her approach, Olivia asked him to explain his alternative. His insight about incorporating mindfulness techniques added a new dimension she hadn't considered. That evening, her journal entry read, "Teaching Revelations. Every person's critical thinking journey is unique. Questions are often more valuable than answers. The best teachers remain students. Growth happens in unexpected directions." The study group continued to evolve. They started taking turns leading sessions, each person bringing their own perspective and experiences. Some focused on emotional intelligence, others on practical problem solving, still others on creative approaches to analysis. During one particularly powerful session, Jennifer shared how she'd adapted the pause technique for her 3-year-old, helping him understand and express his emotions. "It's not just about critical thinking anymore," she said. "It's about critical feeling too." This sparked a deep discussion about how these tools could be adapted for different contexts and ages. The group began collecting stories of how they were sharing these skills with family members, friends, and colleagues. Olivia brought these insights back to her own practice. She found herself becoming more flexible in her application of critical thinking tools, more open to alternative approaches, more willing to experiment with new methods. During one workshop with Elena, she shared how teaching had transformed her understanding. "I thought I was just sharing techniques, but I'm learning that critical thinking is really about creating space for growth, both for ourselves and others." Elena nodded. "That's the beautiful paradox of teaching. The more we share, the more we learn." The timer chimed for her evening reflection, and Olivia wrote, "Growth through teaching. Every person I teach shows me a new aspect of critical thinking. The tools are just the beginning. It's how people use them that matters. True learning happens in community. The best gift we can give others is space to develop their own wisdom. Her action step for the next day: start documenting different approaches to critical thinking for future workshop materials. As she closed her journal, Olivia reflected on how far she'd come from the person who once thought she needed to figure everything out alone. Now she understood that growth wasn't just an individual journey. It was something that happened in connection with others. Her phone buzzed with a group message from the study group. Same time next week, bringing new perspectives and questions. Olivia smiled as she typed her response. Always ready to learn something new. The journey of critical thinking, she was discovering, wasn't just about developing personal wisdom. It was about creating ripples of growth that could touch and transform others. And in that transformation, she found herself growing in ways she never expected. Chapter 8: Crossroads. The offer letter sat unopened in Olivia's inbox like a digital time bomb. A prestigious consulting firm in London, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a career, the kind that would uproot her entire life. 6 months ago, she would have immediately spiraled into analysis paralysis, creating endless pros and cons lists while lying awake at night, imagining every possible outcome. But now, sitting in her quiet apartment as evening light filtered through the windows, she reached for her journal and wrote. Pause before panic P. Present moment awareness. Feel the excitement and fear. Acknowledge all emotions without judgment you. Understand this is a complex decision requiring time S. Step back to see the bigger picture E. Engage with the process rather than rushing to decide. The timing felt almost cosmic. Just that morning, Elena had led a workshop session on making life-changing decisions. The biggest mistakes, she had said, happen when we try to make purely logical decisions about emotional matters, or purely emotional decisions about logical matters. The key is integration. Olivia decided to approach this decision differently than she would have before. Instead of diving straight into analysis, she gave herself permission to feel everything first. She spent an evening just writing about her emotional responses. Fear of leaving her support system, excitement about new possibilities, guilt about potentially abandoning her family, pride in being recognized, anxiety about starting over, hope for what could be. The next day, she brought the situation to her study group, not for advice but for perspective. How do you approach decisions that affect every aspect of your life? Marcus shared how he had made peace with turning down a similar opportunity years ago. Jennifer talked about her own experience moving abroad and what she wished she'd known. Each perspective added new dimensions to consider. What's interesting, Sarah observed, is that you're not frantically making spreadsheets like you would have 6 months ago. Olivia smiled, recognizing the truth in this. Instead of trying to control the uncertainty through excessive analysis, she was learning to sit with it, to let both her thoughts and feelings inform her process. She decided to create what she called a life impact map, a more nuanced version of the traditional pros and cons list. Professional growth, new challenges and skills, international experience, higher visibility, learning curve risks, personal development, independence, cultural exposure, identity evolution, comfort zone expansion, relationships, distance from family, building new connections, maintaining old bonds, dating in a new culture, lifestyle changes, European work culture, travel opportunities, cost of living adjustment, healthcare differences. But unlike her old analysis methods, she didn't stop there. Under each category, she wrote about her emotional responses and deeper motivations. Was her desire for international experience really about career growth? Or was it about proving something to herself? During her therapy session, Dr. Martinez helped her explore these deeper questions. Sometimes, he said, big decisions are actually mirrors showing us what we truly value. This led to another evening of journaling. What am I really choosing between? Safety versus growth. Familiarity versus adventure. Connection versus independence. Past self versus future self. The process wasn't linear. Some days she felt certain about staying, others about going. But instead of seeing this ambivalence as a problem to solve, she recognized it as part of the journey. She took Elena's advice about decision practice, spending a day living as if she'd made each choice, noting her emotional and physical responses. The days she spent deciding to stay, she felt relief but also a nagging sense of regret. The days she spent deciding to go, she felt anxious but alive. Then came the conversation she'd been dreading, telling her parents. Her father, still recovering from his health scare, grew quiet at the news. Her mother immediately started listing concerns about living alone in a foreign country. The old Olivia would have either shut down in the face of their reactions or tried to argue logically. Instead, she applied her integrated thinking. I hear your concerns and they're valid. Can you tell me more about what worries you most? This opened a deeper conversation about family bonds, personal growth, and how love can stretch across oceans. Her father eventually shared how he had once turned down a similar opportunity out of fear, something he still wondered about. At work, the response to her potential departure was mixed. Her team expressed sadness but support. Rachel, her manager, offered valuable perspective. Don't think about what you might lose. Think about who you might become. These words echoed in Olivia's mind as she sat down for her final decision-making session. She had given herself 3 weeks to process, and now it was time to choose. Opening her journal, she wrote, "Integration of head and heart. My analysis shows this is a sound career move. My emotions are mixed, but lean toward excitement. My values align with taking this risk. My fear is normal, but not a reason to stay. My support system will remain regardless of distance. My growth requires stepping into uncertainty." The timer chimed, but this time she didn't need an action step. She opened her laptop and began typing her response to the offer letter. Later that evening, she messaged Elena. "I made the decision by integrating everything you've taught me. It wasn't just about analyzing options. It was about understanding myself." Elena's response came quickly. The best decisions come from knowing ourselves deeply. Critical thinking isn't just about making choices. It's about understanding why we choose what we choose. As Olivia packed up her journal that night, she felt a profound sense of peace. The decision itself wasn't what mattered most. It was the way she'd arrived at it, using both her analytical mind and her emotional wisdom. Her phone buzzed with messages from her study group, reacting to her news. Their responses reflected exactly what she'd learned about community. Support without judgment, questions without pressure, excitement without dismissing fears. Tomorrow would bring the start of planning her transition, whether staying or going. But tonight, she recognized how far she'd come from the person who once thought every decision had to be perfect. She had learned that the best decisions come from integrating all parts of ourselves: logic and emotion, fear and courage, past and future. The evening light faded, casting long shadows across her apartment. Whatever tomorrow would bring, she knew she had made her choice not from fear or impulse, but from a place of integrated wisdom. And that, she realized, was the ultimate test of everything she'd learned. Chapter 9. Moving Forward. The acceptance email to London had been sent 3 weeks ago, and now Olivia's apartment looked like a battlefield between her past and future selves. Half-packed boxes competed for space with scattered possessions, each item demanding a decision. Keep, donate, store, or bring. Even packing requires critical thinking, she muttered, picking up a framed photo from her first day at her current job. The old Olivia would have either kept everything out of sentiment or purged everything in a burst of minimalist enthusiasm. The new Olivia knew better. Opening her journal, she created a framework for this transition. Moving mindfully. Physical transitions, belongings, logistics. Professional transitions, work handover, relationships. Emotional transitions, saying goodbye, preparing for change. Personal transitions, identity shifts, growth opportunities. Elena's words from their last workshop echoed in her mind. Transitions are opportunities to practice integrated thinking. Every practical decision has an emotional component, and every emotional challenge has practical solutions. She began with the professional transition, approaching it with the structured clarity she'd developed. Rather than simply handing over her projects, she created what she called legacy documentation. Project histories with context and decision rationale. Relationship maps showing key stakeholders and dynamics. Lessons learned and potential future challenges. Personal insights about team members' working styles. During one handover session, her colleague Tom remarked, "This is incredibly thorough. Most people just dump their files and run." Olivia smiled, remembering how she once would have done exactly that, either from avoidance or from thinking only about the technical aspects of transition. "I've learned that good handovers are about people as much as processes," she replied. The emotional aspects of transition proved more challenging. Each goodbye coffee or lunch brought mixed feelings that no amount of critical thinking could fully resolve. During one particularly difficult farewell with her study group, she found herself fighting tears. "You know," Marcus said, "it's okay to feel sad and excited at the same time. That's what you taught us. Emotions don't have to be logical to be valid." Hearing her own lessons reflected back to her was both humbling and empowering. That evening, she wrote, "Transition insights. Change can be both right and difficult. Endings and beginnings coexist. Growth requires letting go. Support systems can stretch across oceans." The practical aspects of moving abroad demanded all her newfound skills. Instead of getting overwhelmed by the countless tasks, she applied Elena's time-boxing technique, dedicating specific periods to different aspects of the move. Morning, work handover afternoon, moving logistics evening, personal goodbyes weekend, cultural preparation. She also created what she called decision domains to handle the constant stream of choices. Quick decisions, 5 minutes or less, basic packing choices, daily logistics, simple correspondence, medium decisions, 30 minutes max, housing options, banking arrangements, insurance choices, deep decisions, needs processing time, long-term commitments, relationship transitions, identity choices. This framework helped prevent decision fatigue while ensuring important choices got the attention they deserved. When her mother called, worried about her living alone in London, Olivia was able to share this structured approach, which helped ease some of her concerns. "You've really thought this through," her mother said, sounding relieved. "I've learned that thinking things through doesn't mean overthinking them," Olivia replied, realizing how much her relationship with analysis had evolved. The biggest challenge came when clearing out her home office. Each item seemed to carry memories of her journey. The journal from her first workshop with Elena, sticky notes with half-formed insights, books that had shaped her thinking. As she sorted through them, she realized this wasn't just a physical cleanup. It was a curation of her growth story. She decided to create a transition journal specifically for processing this change. In it, she mapped out her expectations, fears, and hopes for her new life. But unlike her earlier journaling, this wasn't about finding perfect answers. It was about creating a dialogue with herself about the journey ahead. During her final workshop with Elena, she shared some of these insights. "I'm realizing that transition isn't just about moving from A to B. It's about becoming someone new while holding on to who you've been." Elena nodded approvingly. That's the essence of integrated thinking, holding space for transformation while maintaining continuity. As her departure date approached, Olivia faced one final challenge: her goodbye party. The old Olivia would have either avoided it completely or micromanaged every detail. Instead, she let her friends take the lead while contributing in ways that felt authentic to her. The evening was a beautiful chaos of laughter, tears, and shared memories. During a quiet moment, Sarah handed her a package, a new journal for her London life. Inside the cover, each member of her study group had written a message. Marcus's note particularly touched her. "You taught us that critical thinking isn't just about analysis. It's about growing with purpose. Now it's your turn to grow." Later that night, making her final journal entry in her apartment, Olivia wrote, "Transition learnings. Change requires both planning and flexibility. Every ending contains seeds of beginning. Growth happens in the spaces between certainties. Critical thinking creates bridges between old and new. The best transitions honor both heart and mind." The timer chimed one last time in this space. Her action step was simple: begin. As she packed her journals, both old and new, Olivia reflected on how different this transition felt from changes in her past. She wasn't trying to escape or reinvent herself. Instead, she was consciously evolving, carrying forward the lessons learned while opening herself to new growth. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Remember, critical thinking isn't just about making good decisions. It's about making decisions that help you become who you want to be. Looking around at her half-packed apartment, Olivia felt a deep sense of peace. The uncertainty ahead didn't paralyze her anymore. She had learned that the best decisions come not from perfect analysis, but from integrated wisdom. The kind that recognizes that every transition is both an ending and a beginning, both a challenge and an opportunity. Tomorrow would bring more boxes, more goodbyes, more decisions. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel everything. The sadness, the excitement, the fear, and the hope. This, she realized, was what real growth felt like. Not the absence of uncertainty, but the courage to move forward with it. Her new journal lay ready on her nightstand, its blank pages promising new stories, new insights, new growth. The London chapter was about to begin, and for the first time in her life, Olivia felt ready not just to think about change, but to embrace it fully, with both her mind and her heart engaged in the journey. Chapter 10. Starting anew. The London rain was different from home, Olivia decided, watching droplets trace patterns on her new apartment's window. It was gentler somehow, more persistent, like the city itself was teaching her a lesson about patience and persistence. 3 weeks into her new life, she sat at her small desk by the window, London skyline a mix of historic spires and modern glass towers in the distance. Her new journal lay open before her, its pages already filling with observations and insights. First impressions framework. External changes. Language variations, cultural norms, daily routines. Internal changes. Heightened awareness, shifting perspectives, evolving identity. Growth opportunities, cultural learning, professional challenges, personal development. Integration needs. Balancing old habits with new patterns. Elena's final piece of advice before she left had been profound. Don't just observe your new life. Participate in its creation. Taking this to heart, Olivia had developed what she called her conscious adaptation strategy. Instead of either clinging to old patterns or trying to completely reinvent herself, she approached each new experience with integrated thinking. When her British colleagues invited her to their weekly pub gathering, she analyzed both the professional benefits and her personal comfort levels before accepting. During her first team meeting at the new firm, she noticed how different the communication style was, more subtle, laden with understatement and dry humor. Rather than feeling lost, she wrote in her journal, Cultural communication analysis. Direct versus indirect styles. Humor as social currency. Implied meanings versus stated ones. Power dynamics and politeness. This analytical approach helped her navigate the cultural differences while maintaining her authentic self. She wasn't trying to become British overnight, but rather to understand and adapt while staying true to her core values. One particularly challenging moment came during a client presentation. She had prepared thoroughly, but the client's response seemed lukewarm. Later, her new manager, James, pulled her aside. Brilliant content, he said, but perhaps a bit too enthusiastic for our London clients. They prefer their expertise served with a dash of self-deprecation. The old Olivia would have either defensively justified her style or anxiously tried to completely change it. Instead, she took out her journal that evening. Pause analysis of presentation P. Present reality. Different cultural expectations A. Acknowledge feelings. Frustration but also curiosity U. Understand context. Cultural communication styles S. Step back. What can I learn from this? E. Engage. How to adapt while staying authentic. This reflection led her to develop a hybrid presentation style that maintained her clarity while incorporating more British sensibilities. It was a small win, but it represented something bigger, the ability to adapt without losing herself. Her weekly video calls with the study group became anchors in her new life. They had evolved into a kind of international think tank, each member bringing perspectives from their own challenges and growth. It's fascinating, Marcus commented during one call, how you're using critical thinking to navigate cultural adaptation. It's like you're creating a new framework for international transitions. This observation sparked an idea. Olivia began documenting her adaptation process more systematically. thinking it might help others in similar situations. She created what she called the Cultural Integration Matrix. 1. Observation phase. Document differences without judgment. Notice emotional responses. Identify patterns and norms. Analysis phase. Compare with familiar contexts. Understand underlying values. Recognize potential growth areas. Integration phase. Experiment with adaptation. Maintain authentic core. Create hybrid approaches. Evolution phase. Develop new perspectives. Enrich personal identity. Contribute unique insights. Her apartment gradually transformed from a blank slate into a home, each decision about its arrangement reflecting her evolving identity. She placed her old journals on a shelf alongside new books about British history and culture, a physical representation of her growing integration. One rainy Sunday, as she explored her new neighborhood, she found herself in a small bookshop. The elderly owner, noticing her accent, struck up a conversation about American authors. What started as a casual chat turned into a 2-hour discussion about cultural perspectives in literature. That evening, she wrote, Integration Insights. Every interaction is an opportunity for learning. Cultural differences reveal unconscious assumptions. Growth happens in the space between familiar and foreign. Identity is both stable and evolving. Her professional life began to take on new dimensions as well. The London office operated differently from what she was used to, with more emphasis on long-term relationships and subtle negotiations. She found herself drawing on everything she'd learned about integrated thinking to navigate these new waters. During a particularly challenging client meeting, where cultural and professional expectations seemed to clash, she remembered Elena's words about holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. Instead of trying to force one approach, she created space for dialogue that bridged different ways of thinking. You have an interesting way of bringing people together, her colleague Charlotte observed afterward. It's like you can see all the angles at once. This comment led to another journal entry. Professional evolution. Critical thinking translates across cultures. Integration skills facilitate connection. Adaptation doesn't mean abandonment. Growth comes from synthesis, not surrender. As her first month in London drew to a close, Olivia received an email from Elena. How are you applying your skills in your new context? The response she crafted surprised her with its clarity. I'm learning that critical thinking isn't just about analyzing situations. It's about creating bridges between different ways of being. Every day brings opportunities to integrate new perspectives while honoring old wisdom. London isn't just teaching me about a new culture. It's showing me new ways to think about thinking itself. That evening, settling into her new favorite spot by the window, Olivia realized something profound. The rain that had seemed so foreign 3 weeks ago now felt familiar, even comforting. Just as she had learned to integrate critical thinking with emotional intelligence, she was now learning to integrate different cultural ways of seeing and being. Her timer chimed for her evening reflection, and she wrote, New Horizons Insights. Every ending leads to unexpected beginnings. Growth requires both roots and wings. Integration happens in small daily choices. Identity expands through conscious adaptation. Critical thinking creates bridges across cultures. Her action step for tomorrow was simple but significant. Start a London critical thinking group. As she closed her journal, a sense of possibility washed over her. She wasn't just surviving in a new place. She was creating something new, both within herself and in her environment. The journey of critical thinking, she realized, never really ended. It just kept opening new doors, leading to new horizons, each one richer and more complex than the last. The London rain continued its gentle percussion against her window, no longer foreign, not quite familiar, but perfectly suited to this new chapter of her story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new insights, new opportunities for growth. And for the first time in her life, Olivia felt fully equipped to embrace them all, with both heart and mind engaged in the continuing adventure of conscious living. Chapter 11. Creating Ripples. The London Critical Thinking Group started modestly enough. Just Olivia and 3 colleagues from her firm meeting in a quiet corner of a local cafe. Charlotte, who had been intrigued by Olivia's approach to the challenging client meeting, brought along two others, Dev from IT and Maria from marketing. "I'm not sure what I expected," Charlotte admitted during their first meeting, "but I know we need something different. The old ways of thinking aren't keeping up with how fast everything's changing." Olivia opened her journal, smiling at how familiar this felt, even thousands of miles from her original study group. "Let's start with something I learned from my mentor," she said. "It's called the pause method." As she explained the framework, she watched their faces shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. Dev, who had been skeptical at first, suddenly sat up straighter when she described how the method could help with technical decision-making. "This could completely change how we approach system updates," he said, already scribbling notes. "We're always rushing to solutions before we truly understand the problems." Maria nodded enthusiastically. "And in marketing, we often get so caught up in trends that we forget to step back and analyze what our audience really needs." The session flew by, and before they knew it, 2 hours had passed. As they packed up, Charlotte lingered. "There's something different about how you approach problems," she said. "It's like you're combining analytical thinking with something else." "Emotional intelligence," Olivia supplied. "I used to think they were separate skills, but now I see them as two parts of the same whole." That evening, during her weekly video call with her original study group back home, Olivia shared her experience starting the London group. "It feels like coming full circle," she said. "Like I'm passing on what I learned, but also learning so much more in the process." Marcus smiled knowingly. "That's how it works, isn't it? The more you share, the more you grow." In her journal that night, Olivia wrote, "Teaching others, growing self. Each explanation deepens understanding. Different perspectives enhance the tools. Cultural variations add new dimensions. Growth happens in community." The London group grew quickly. Word spread, and soon they had to move to a larger space. Each week brought new faces and new challenges to explore. Olivia found herself adapting the tools she'd learned to address different cultural contexts and professional situations. During one particularly memorable session, they tackled the challenge of cross-cultural communication in global teams. Dev shared his frustration with late-night calls to Asia, while Maria spoke about miscommunications with American colleagues. Olivia introduced them to her cultural integration matrix, but something interesting happened. As the group discussed it, they began adding their own dimensions and insights. The matrix evolved, becoming richer and more nuanced with each contribution. "This is brilliant," Charlotte said afterward. "We're not just learning tools, we're creating new ones together." But success brought its own challenges. As the group grew, Olivia found herself struggling with familiar doubts. Was she qualified to lead this? Was she doing enough? Was she doing it right? One evening, feeling particularly overwhelmed, she opened her journal. Pause in progress P. Present moment. Feeling the weight of responsibility. Acknowledge. Both pride and anxiety are present you. Understand. Growth involves uncertainty. S. Step back. What would Elena say? E. Engage. How can this challenge become an opportunity? The answer came unexpectedly. During the next session, instead of leading as usual, she decided to step back and let others facilitate different segments. The result was transformative. Each person brought their own style and insights, creating a richer learning environment than she could have created alone. This experience led to a new structure for the group, where leadership rotated and everyone contributed their expertise. The sessions became more dynamic, blending different cultural perspectives with various professional insights. One particular breakthrough came when Maria suggested combining the pause method with traditional British problem-solving approaches. The resulting hybrid framework proved surprisingly effective, especially in their conservative corporate environment. It's like we're creating a new language, Dev observed, one that bridges different ways of thinking. Olivia shared these developments with Elena via email, who responded with characteristic wisdom. Remember, the goal isn't to replicate what you learned, but to let it evolve and grow in new soil. This permission to innovate freed something in Olivia. She began to see how her journey with critical thinking was part of a larger pattern of evolution. Each person who engaged with these tools changed them, improved them, made them their own. During one session, As she watched Charlotte masterfully guide the group through a complex analysis using a combination of techniques, Olivia felt a profound sense of completion. She wrote in her journal, "Full circle moments. Teaching becomes learning. Tools evolve through sharing. Growth spreads in unexpected ways. Leadership means letting others lead. Everything builds on what came before." The impact of the group began to ripple outward. Participants reported better decision-making at work, improved relationships, and greater confidence in handling complex situations. Some started their own smaller groups in their departments or with their teams. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Olivia viewed her own growth. She no longer saw herself as someone who had mastered critical thinking, but as part of an ongoing evolution of thought and practice. During one rainy evening session, as the group worked through a particularly challenging case study, Olivia looked around the room. Dev was sketching a decision tree on the whiteboard. Maria was offering insights about emotional intelligence and marketing, and Charlotte was taking notes in her own journal, a habit she'd picked up from Olivia. In that moment, Olivia realized something profound. The tools and techniques weren't the most important part of what she'd learned and was now sharing. The real value was in creating spaces where people could think differently together, where growth was collaborative rather than competitive. Her timer chimed for her evening reflection, and she wrote, "Legacy thoughts. True growth creates more growth. Teaching is a form of learning. Evolution happens through sharing. Every end is a new beginning." Her action step surprised her. Start planning the next evolution. As she closed her journal, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah back home. "You've created something beautiful there. We can feel the ripples even here." Olivia smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from the person who once thought she needed to have all the answers. Now she understood that the real joy wasn't in having answers, but in creating spaces where questions could lead to collective growth. The London rain continued outside, but it no longer seemed foreign or familiar. It was simply part of the ongoing story, a reminder that growth, like water, finds its own paths and creates its own patterns. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities for evolution. And Olivia was ready, not because she had all the answers, but because she had learned to love the questions themselves. Chapter 12. The Continuing Journey. 1 year after her move to London, Olivia found herself on a plane headed home for a visit. Her original journal sat in her lap, its pages worn and familiar, while her newest London journal, filled with fresh insights, rested in her bag. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, she opened the old journal, tracing her fingers over entries from what felt like a lifetime ago. "It's strange," she wrote in her current journal, "how you can return to the same words and find new meanings in them. Like the person who wrote them and the person reading them are having a conversation across time." The trip home wasn't just a visit. She had been invited to speak at a leadership conference about critical thinking and cultural adaptation. The invitation had arrived 3 months ago, and her initial reaction had surprised her. Instead of anxiety, she felt ready, not confident in a brittle way, but grounded in her experiences and the wisdom they had brought. Her presentation was titled The Integration Journey, Critical Thinking Across Cultures, but it was really about something bigger, the way growth spirals upward, revisiting familiar ground from new heights. She had structured it around what she called the 5 realizations. Critical thinking is not just a skill, but a way of being. Integration happens at multiple levels simultaneously. Growth occurs in community, not isolation. Teaching and learning are 2 sides of the same coin. Every ending contains the seeds of new beginnings. As she reviewed her notes, memories flooded back. Her first workshop with Elena, the early morning study groups, the struggles and breakthroughs, and now her London critical thinking group, which had grown to over 30 regular members. The plane touched down, and Sarah was waiting at arrivals, practically bouncing with excitement. They hugged tightly, and Olivia felt the strange sensation of being both different and exactly the same. "The study group can't wait to see you," Sarah said as they drove from the airport. "We've been applying your London innovations to our sessions. That cultural integration matrix? It works for departmental differences too, not just international ones." Over dinner that evening, Catching up with her old study group, Olivia saw how everyone had grown in their own ways. Marcus had started mentoring junior employees in critical thinking techniques. Jennifer had developed new approaches for working parents to manage overwhelm. They were all evolving the tools, making them their own. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said, "When you first left, we worried the group wouldn't be the same without you. But your leaving actually pushed us to step up in new ways." Olivia nodded, understanding completely. That's the thing about real growth. It creates more growth. The conference presentation itself became a demonstration of everything she'd learned. Instead of delivering a traditional speech, she created an interactive session that combined elements from both her original training with Elena and her London innovations. Critical thinking, she told the audience, isn't about eliminating uncertainty. It's about dancing with it. It's about finding ways to move forward even when we don't have all the answers. She shared stories from both sides of the Atlantic, showing how different cultures approached similar challenges. But more importantly, she showed how these differences could enrich rather than complicate our understanding. During the Q&A, someone asked how she handled the pressure of major life changes. Olivia smiled, remembering her old patterns of anxiety and overthinking. "I learned that pressure isn't the enemy," she replied. "It's information. The key is learning to listen to it without being ruled by it." After the conference, Elena met her for coffee. Seeing her mentor again was both emotional and illuminating. They had maintained regular contact, but sitting across from her felt different, like meeting as colleagues rather than teacher and student. "You've created something beautiful," Elena said, "but more importantly, you've allowed it to create you." That evening, in her old favorite cafe, Olivia wrote, "Full Circle Insights. Every return shows us how far we've come. Growth isn't linear, but spiral. Teaching is the highest form of learning. Community creates exponential growth. The journey never really ends." Her phone buzzed with messages from her London group, sharing how their latest session had gone. They were already incorporating ideas from her conference presentation, adapting them for their own needs. Looking at her two journals side by side, the old and the new, Olivia realized something profound. The person she had been when she started this journey wasn't gone. She had evolved. Her old patterns of overthinking had transformed into tools for deeper understanding. Her anxiety about uncertainty had become curiosity about possibilities. She wrote, "The journey continues. Each ending creates new beginnings. Every tool can be reimagined. Growth spirals upward, not forward. Integration never stops. Wisdom comes from living questions." As she prepared to return to London, Olivia felt a deep sense of completion that paradoxically opened up new possibilities. She wasn't finishing a journey, but continuing one that would keep evolving as long as she remained open to growth. Her timer chimed one last time in her old cafe. Her action step wasn't about doing something new, but about recommitting to the ongoing journey. Keep dancing with uncertainty. Later that night, packing for her return flight, she placed both journals in her carry-on bag. The old one reminded her where she'd come from. The new one showed her where she might go. But the real journey, she knew, wasn't recorded in either book. It was written in the way she now moved through the world, in the ripples she created, and in the growth she inspired in others. Her phone buzzed with a final message from Elena. "Remember, the best teachers never stop being students." Olivia smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities for growth. But now she understood that was exactly as it should be. The journey of critical thinking wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about continuing to evolve, to learn, to grow. And she was ready for whatever came next, not because she had all the answers, but because she had learned to love the questions themselves. Epilogue: Seeds of Change. 2 years after her first workshop with Elena, Olivia sat in her London apartment, surrounded by journals, some completed, some in progress, each marking different phases of her journey. Outside, the familiar London rain created a gentle backdrop to her reflection. She was writing the introduction to a book Elena had encouraged her to create, one that would share her journey and insights with a wider audience. As she typed, she could almost hear the voices of all those who had been part of her story, Elena, her study group back home, her London critical thinking group, and countless others who had contributed to her understanding. The London group had evolved beyond her wildest expectations. What started as a small gathering in a cafe had grown into multiple groups across the city, each with its own flavor, but connected by common threads of integrated thinking and continuous growth. Other offices of her firm had begun implementing similar programs, creating a network of critical thinkers across continents. Her original study group back home was thriving too, having developed their own unique approaches while maintaining the core principles they'd learned together. They still met virtually every month, sharing new insights and challenges across the ocean. Opening her current journal, Olivia wrote, "Looking back, looking forward, every step created possibilities I couldn't have imagined. Growth happens in spirals, revisiting old ground with new wisdom. Teaching and learning are eternal companions. Change creates ripples we may never see. The journey is the destination." Her phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. The Singapore office wants to start their own group. They're asking if you'll consult with them. Another message followed, this one from Elena. "Ready to co-facilitate the international workshop next month?" Olivia smiled, remembering the frightened, overthinking person she had been, who would have been paralyzed by such opportunities. Now she felt not certainty, but a comfortable readiness to engage with whatever came next. She had learned that critical thinking wasn't about eliminating uncertainty or finding perfect answers. It was about developing the wisdom to navigate complexity, the courage to remain open to growth, and the humility to keep learning. Her timer chimed, a habit she still maintained, and she wrote her action step, begin the next chapter. As she closed her journal, she reflected on how every ending had led to new beginnings, how every challenge had contained opportunities for growth, and how every person she'd encountered had added something unique to her understanding. The rain continued outside, its rhythm as familiar now as her own heartbeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities for growth. But now she knew that was exactly as it should be. The journey of critical thinking, she had learned, never really ends. It just keeps expanding, creating new ripples of understanding that touch lives in ways we may never fully know. And that, perhaps, was the most beautiful lesson of all. Her phone buzzed one final time. A group message from both her London and home study groups. Remember where it all began? Look how far we've all come. Olivia opened her original journal one last time, running her fingers over those first uncertain entries. Then she opened her laptop and began to write. The journey of critical thinking begins with a single question and continues with every breath we take. It's not about finding all the answers, but about learning to love the questions themselves. This is my story, but it's also your story, because every journey of growth creates ripples that touch other lives, and those ripples create ripples of their own. Welcome to the continuing adventure. The rain fell softly outside, nature's reminder that growth, like water, finds its own path. And somewhere, someone else was beginning their own journey, asking their first questions, taking their first steps toward integrated thinking and conscious growth. The story continues, as all good stories do, not with an ending, but with new beginnings waiting to unfold. In her final journal entry of the day, Olivia wrote, "To all those starting their journey, may you find the courage to question the wisdom, to listen the strength to grow, and the joy of continuous discovery. The path is yours to create. The questions are yours to ask. The growth is yours to embrace. Welcome to the adventure." And with that, she closed her journal, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that every end is just another beginning in disguise. The rain continued its gentle pattern, a reminder that some things change while others remain constant, and that wisdom lies in knowing the difference, and in remaining open to both. The journey continues,